Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs with your co hosts, Marsha and Claire.
Hello.
Hello. This episode is episode 17, and we are covering the 1984 film Threads. So, Claire, what did you think of this movie?
Okay, so anyone who has not watched this film, I think don't watch it if you're feeling fragile in any way.
Yes,
It's
this isn't like I've come
harrowing.
back from work, evening little movie. This is like, okay, deep stuff. It's going to get you thinking. It's going to get you quite, yeah,
Yeah, I mean
yeah.
it is a tough watch. I was saying that like normally I watch these films or read the books whatever a couple of times before we record. Couldn't do it, but that's okay because it is literally emblazoned on my eyeballs, I think,
Yeah,
from like the
seared into my
whole
memory,
kind of
really.
process of watching it.
Mm.
So it's one of those films that like I didn't know about. I guess it was made before I was born. Not by that much, but it was before I was born. And It's sort of passed me by a little bit. So you told us about it and like the link to Sheffield's and so on. So that was sort of one of our things. But it's one of these films that I definitely feel like people
Mm.
should watch. I don't think that it's lost its impact. So it was a film made for TV and made for the BBC that basically was the first attempt to show as realistically as possible the impact of a nuclear attack on a city the size of Sheffield, obviously,
Mm.
um, and the fallout and the impact of radiation and of nuclear winter and the societal breakdown that followed it. And for a film that was made in 1984, I mean, was a version of it that has been touched up, but even so, I think that it's a film that is sort of both of its time and also like way ahead of its time. It felt I couldn't believe when I was reading about like how they were using breakfast cereal and ketchup to do the sort of impact of nuclear burns and things like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but
Oh,
because
yeah,
I just
yeah.
think it's so effective the way that
Yeah, it has
it's done on
some.
screen.
I think in today's like sort of value of currency, I think it was just over £1 million budget, I
Mm.
think. But yeah, for the size, it was incredibly like convincing. I
Yeah,
was the effects were really good.
yeah.
I genuinely, I think it's a very impressive production for the time
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. And it, it comes from say sort of 1984, so we're um the ongoing fear of nuclear war from the dropping of the atomic bomb and then through the development of nuclear weapons
Hmm.
more widely in the world, specifically in Russia, through to the Cold War. And that's kind of the point at which we're really looking at here with CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, having been active for a few years. So we're not long after the first process at Greenham Common, for example. So this is kind of its time in that sense. But it also feels like something that kind of hasn't gone away. So yeah, and I think the other thing that's really good about this that we've talked about before is the way in which it sort of focuses on it's not a global picture. It's like the individuals. It's Ruth specifically and Ruth's family and Jimmy, this young
Hmm.
couple with an unexpected pregnancy that kind of runs parallel to the sort of imminence of nuclear war. And that's a nuclear attack, which is based very much on the kind of I guess the historical threats, so the threats of the mid 80s. It's NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. So that's kind of like the Western defensive union versus the Eastern defensive union. Um, and so, it's reflecting kind of current issues of its time. But yeah, so in nuclear war, I've been reading lots about nuclear war this week. That has been my focus. Um, but as always, Marsha, you have to do science stuff for us now.
Yes.
Tell us about nuclear attacks?
So, well, in terms of the actual stages of suffering a nuclear blast, there's a couple of things that happen. So you have the initial blast, which is obviously classic sort of bomb falls, massive destruction, like to infrastructure, immediate loss of life, lots of fires, and it has a huge devastating effect on a massive area. Then there's sort of the effects of the thermal radiation, and this is where there's further destruction sort of caused by like massive fires, which usually spread due to like wind. There's lots of intense burning and heat and light. And then this is kind of the bit that everyone hears about is like is nuclear fallout. And so that's after the initial explosion. This is where lots of radioactive debris and dust, you sort of the mushroom cloud, all of that starts to sort of rain down slowly. And I think there's a lot of talk about in the film where that can also spread outside of the direct sort of blast zone due to the sort of wind and stuff. And all of this can contaminate the like surrounding environment. So that's the air, the soil, the water, food supplies, and also has like a long-term effect on the soil in terms of growing crops. I think we hear about with a lot about like Hiroshima and stuff, and Nagasaki is like afterwards.
Yeah, and I was reading that like
Chernobyl as well.
Yeah, and even like things like the test site for the Manhattan Project in New Mexico still has like 10 times the radiation of the surrounding area.
And that lasts a long time. It's effects for ages, which we kind of see the film goes into. We'll talk more about it, but it kind of expands almost 13 years after impact. And I guess the bit that I'm more like maybe qualified to talk about is the acute radiation syndrome, which
Let us move away from the physics as quickly as we can.
As quickly as we can,
biology.
People are exposed to these high levels of radiation from the blast and the fallout, develop acute radiation syndrome. I'll go through some of the fun little facts about that. But this basically leads to a range of things. A lot of nausea and vomiting, I'd say, but then it kind of like sort of descends into organ failure and death, which isn't as fun. And it all kind of depends on levels of exposure. But a fun little fact for you, for a 50% mortality rate, the distance that you want to be from the hypercenter of the blast is 892 plus minus 11 meters outside of this center. So if you do happen to be in a nuclear blast, I'll try and be that distance from where like the bomb dropped. I mean, obviously the people at the hypercenter would have died. I was surprised I didn't see much more imagery of, is I know a lot of like the photography that you see, like a lot of the documentation you see from Hiroshima is like of the shadows that people have have left who have been at the center of this of the blast. Like I think it was said that they instantly just sort of vaporize, and there's these shadows that are left of there where they were standing, which is just always been a very harrowing image.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, all sorts of things about the sort of like impact of this kind of blast, like the way that victims who were wearing like striped clothes, you could see the striping on the bodily remains and things like that. So you're right. And I suppose that one of the things with the film is it does show some close up of the disaster, but it's almost so close up that you don't get that kind of effect. You don't get that sort of like bigger photograph or anything like that. The whole film is very much like, what would it be like to be in this?
Very much focused on the people of Sheffield who are like directly at the center of it.
Just thinking, you mentioned Chernobyl there, because so the Chernobyl disaster was in 86, I think. So just really not very long after this film was made. And certainly I remember studying that at school. So would have been on the geography syllabus in the 90s, late 90s, early noughts, something like that. And just there was like that time span, which I'm just thinking is very similar kind of to what we're talking about, and just looking at the kind of the images of the impact of radiation on the animals and on the babies born and things like that has really stayed with me from then.
One of the things that was, will stay a long time from then is the short-term and long-term effects of radiation poisoning, which we'll get into. So radiation poisoning, the general symptoms of that are lots of nausea, feelings of thirst, which we see in the film, loss of appetite, discomfort, fever, and diarrhea. So there's a lot of fluids coming out of you. So some of the sort of direct effects is when you get exposed to radiation, the effects are on your bone marrow, gastrointestinal system, and also your central nervous system can be affected as well. And this is where the like sort of root of the symptoms come from. Your bone marrow especially is the site of production of the blood cells, the red and white blood cells. And when exposed to 2 to 10 grays of radiation, which I think this is I think it used to be, a lot of people talked about it in rads, radians, I think, rads. But that's 1 gray radiation, I think, is 1 joule of energy, which is 100 rads, for people out there who need a bit more. But I'll be talking about it in grays. So 2 to 3 grays of radiation will cause the bone marrow to be broken down, which causes the ceasing of like red and white blood cell production, as well as platelets, I believe. As it kills, I think 4.5 grays kills 95% of stem cells, which are again, those of you who need a bit more background on the biology, stem cells are where are like sort of reservoirs of cell division, and these stem cells will then sort of grow and change and become specialized to become red and white blood cells. But yes, the loss of platelets will also greatly increase the chances of a hemorrhage, and a fall in red blood cells can sort of cause mild anemia. But yeah, after 24 hours of this sort of exposure, this causes vomiting, diarrhea, and can even lead to sort of like long-term effects being sepsis, infections, and internal bleeding. Gastrointestinal death, I think, is also loss of lots of cells in the gastrointestinal tract, also causes lots of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, lots of pain. Yeah, so that's lots going on there. I think another interesting thing is especially like the effect on fertility, and we'll see also the effect of radiation on sort of prenatal children. There's in Threads they kind of almost had this like generational impact scene, which I guess we'll discuss. But yeah, no, I think from just 2.5 grays of radiation, that's like in men, that's 2 to 3 years of infertility, up to 4, that's permanent sterile. You're sterile from that point. And we also see the effect of radiation on causing vision impairment and cataracts. That's a huge one, I think, that's talked about in Threads.
What about cancer? How does it link with cancer?
So radiation has a huge effect on sort of the mutation and replication of like DNA in the cells, and it can sort of disrupt that process, introducing a lot of sort of differences into your genome. These things can develop into cancer. So cancer is a huge one, which I think we hear about all the time, especially people who work on sort of radiology floors in hospitals and stuff, and who get, also work with other sort of radioactive like associated fields of work.
And I was thinking about years and years, because there we have the nuclear attack on Hongqiao and the impact of the radiation
Yes.
on the eldest sister, wasn't it? So
Yes,
we've sort of talked about that a little bit before.
So this is I think there's some statistics that say 1 out of every 80 people exposed to 1 gray of radiation will die from cancer, and 1 in 40 people get cancer in addition to the typical rates of 16 to 20 out of 40. But yeah, different cancers appear. So 2 years sort of post-exposure will be leukemia, or 20 or more years, or continuous exposure, I believe. 20 or more years will be like more like skin cancer and lung cancer. But yeah, that's a huge one that sort of goes on. And I think people, on who work on like sort of hospital floors, especially, they use a lot of like radiating equipment and stuff, have like radiation counters, and there's only like there's a sort of maximum amount you have to like you can be exposed to before having to take like a break, I think, which is all very serious.
We see this quite a lot in sort of like science fiction-y type things, don't we? Like the sort of the sort of like people who wear like a Geiger counter or whatever, and like it's part of them, it's like embedded in them. And we're going to do a episode on Fallout later in the year. That's just one kind of many post-apocalyptic sort of ways of living in an irradiated world or whatever.
I mean, one of the sort of long-term, outside of the biology sort of effects we see is we see the depiction of a nuclear winter, which is a severe sort of prolonged cooling of the climate. And this is kind of, I think, as I was talking about the thermal radiation effects, you get all these fires after this nuclear blast, and those fires directly sort of inject soot into the atmosphere, blocking out sunlight, and causing like this cooling and sort of darkness to come over, our atmosphere and the world. And this is like leads to crop failure and famine. So on top of the fact that you have all of these terrible health effects from radiation, and probably all these wounds and terrible stuff, everyone's also starving to death, which we also see the effect of, which is really fun.
And my understanding is that once the soot starts to clear and the sun starts to come through, because of the damage to the ozone layer, you're then suffering with higher UV.
Higher UV as well. There's huge damage to the ozone layer. So suffering.
And I was saying that, in as part of my grand exploration of nuclear war, having watched Threads, I watched Oppenheimer, and one of the sort of things that, with the first atomic bombs and the understanding of the impact, was this great question about whether whether there was any chance of nuclear reaction being unstoppable, essentially.
And causing the sort of detonation of the atmosphere, I think it was.
Right down to kind of the moment where they're testing the Trinity bomb, and the last thing he said to him is like,
that they
don't destroy the world.
And the fact that they
nearly
went through with it,
we're told, like nearly zero chance that we're going to destroy the world, but it's theories. I
can't believe that still was gone through with.
I know,
it's just
exactly.
Incredible.
And I think that what's interesting, talking about kind of like nuclear winter, was what I was reading about in terms of Threads is, although it's not the first depiction of nuclear war on film, it is the first depiction of nuclear winter. And that, I think, particularly this theory of nuclear winter, which I understand has actually been refined since then to what I read is called nuclear autumn. So not quite as bad as perhaps we might fear in terms of temperatures dropping, but nonetheless a significant impact. But once it had been like raised as like a theoretical outcome of nuclear explosions on sort of a war scale, it made this huge difference, because what you start to think about is not just kind of the impact of the bomb or even the radiation, it's the world impact. And actually, so there was a quote that I really liked in this cool new book, which I talked about in the newsletter briefly, by Dorian Lynskey. It's called Everything Must Go, The Stories We Tell About the End of the World. It's got a whole section dedicated to the bomb. And it talks about this kind of impact that when you start, like when people who have nuclear weapons start realizing that nuclear winter is a potential consequence, it completely sort of changes their attitude to fighting a nuclear war, and we move much more towards this idea of kind of the deterrent sort of effect of having nuclear weapons but not using them, which we can talk about whether we believe this is a thing. But it said in this book, nuclear winter changed the risk calculus of nuclear war. That's a quote from Martin Amis, the author. It is the best news because it is the worst news.
Yes,
so knowing
yeah.
just how bad it would be actually made a really big difference to the chances of anybody using nuclear weapons on the scale that they had achieved in terms of and we have, well, theoretically we have stopped kind of making bigger and bigger bombs, as I understand it. After the use of uranium and plutonium bombs, there's this discussion about whether or not it was right to create the hydrogen bomb, the H bomb, which of course was indeed developed and tested, but it's never been used in actual conflict. But there was I think the international movement against nuclear weapons prevented the development of the bigger bomb, the neutron bomb. So we can blow up the entire world, but we can't blow it up quite as much as we might be able to if we made a bigger bomb. It's just madness. So there we go. That's our little account of nuclear war. Now, importantly, this is set in Sheffield. Marsha lives in Sheffield. So what did you think about the setting?
You know what? I was surprised that it wasn't. I when I was speaking to people about the film, my partner had recommended it to me, and I was like, I proposed it to Claire as our next, episode. That I thought
Little
did
we know what we were letting ourselves in for.
Literally, what we're getting roped into. But yeah, I mean, it's not really all that focused on. Like, I thought there'd be more sort of focused on the local kind of scenery and stuff. I think I maybe recognised just the centre of town, the little shopping centre, like where they pan the camera over as the new initial blast was coming. But yeah,
I suppose it's for Sheffield of 40 years ago.
Yeah,
most of what we see is Sheffield blown up. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I think they more use it as a tool. I don't know, maybe this is me just not being that familiar with my environment. I've only been living here for a year, but I think they just use it as more of a illustrative setting. As I think that it was the fourth largest city in the UK at that point. I don't know if it still is. I don't think.
No.
Of maybe was it a population of 500,000, I think, 500,000.
Oh, you might be right. I'm not sure. I certainly know that it was of sufficient. I mean, there's two sort of things that make it realistic insofar as, I mean, even in the 1980s, with all the problems with British industry and strike action and so on, which play a part in the film, it was still an industrial centre, would have been seen as such by an enemy seeking targets. And also, it is. If we're thinking about NATO strategic targets, then that is not far from a NATO base. I can't remember exactly how far, but the idea was, that obviously, there we go. RAF Finningley is 17 miles from Sheffield, so that's obviously a direct attack on the Air Force as part of NATO allies, and then Sheffield itself is the third of the strikes that we see in the film, which has particular kind of British economic targets of the time. The other reason I understand that it was filmed in Sheffield, apart from the fact that it fitted Barry Hines, who's the writer, famous for Kes, and the book that it was based on, which again I remember reading and watching in primary school, was very impactful then. It fits with his background in the world in which he moved to. It was an area that he knew, but also Sheffield had declared itself a nuclear-free zone. So there was a lot of sort of support, I guess, for using the town hall, for example, to fit with that particular agenda. So it's sort of fitting in that regard as well. And I know that like it's obviously loads of extras in it, and a lot of the extras were people who supported CND. So there was a lot of the local movement then being used to support that. Do you know, by the way, whether the traffic warden that your local documentary film festival has been searching for has been located?
No, not yet. I think there was even a BBC article that was published about it yesterday that I saw. Yeah, for anyone who hasn't seen, there's the Sheffield Documentary Festival going on. I think I've got a leaflet for it here right now. Very beautiful poster. Obviously, our podcast listeners can't see this, but
that's it, right? You did some excellent actions earlier. We will put it on. We'll put a photo of it on our
very nice.
Instagram.
Looks that for my wall. But yeah, I think it's Reflections on Realities is what it's called. And yes, so it's just a film festival that's going on in Sheffield, and they're doing a bit on Threads, I believe. And they're looking for, there's this very kind of recognizable image of a traffic warden wrapped up in bandages that's sort of seen, sort of keeping down these rallies of people looking for food, I think, or I even was it at like a concentration camp section in the movie?
So it's the like the prison, the closest thing that they've got, isn't it, where basically they're having to use everybody who was like a sort of any kind of law enforcement, including traffic wardens, and it's sort of part of the irony of it. Exactly. And what I read oh yeah, there you go. There's a BBC article. Threads, man who played traffic warden sought by filmmakers.
Yes, they're looking for him, basically.
Yeah,
they are.
Do you know the traffic warden? My God, it's really like scary and sort of dystopian in itself. But yeah, this sort of it was interesting because this image kind of had a like a return to prominence when Meta launched the Threads app. Because it crossed over with the name, so like this was posted early on, and sort of like I suppose a bit of a a critique of big tech or something like that it was being used there. But
I think he was like in the post in the sort of they're looking for this traffic warden. I think it says that he was this extra may have actually just been a traffic warden in real life, and they just picked up just to be.
They obviously had no budget, so that would make a lot of sense.
No budget.
It? Just like wear your work clothes.
Wear your work clothes. We'll wrap you up in bandages. But I think he was just in the film for 30 seconds total, but then they used that image to like market a lot.
So it's become iconic, and I think that it's iconic in a way that people probably don't certainly for me, like I recognize the image, me too. Hadn't seen the film, so it's sort of taken a life of its own. So there we go, listeners. If you are in fact the traffic warden or know them, then we're doing our bit for public service there.
Please write in.
But I mean, I thought the thing was effective about the Sheffield setting was, I guess that first of all, it really allowed this focus on kind of working class and lower middle class families, which we see with our two central families, with Jimmy's family and Ruth's family, and like that kind of like going about your normal business in a way that isn't necessary, just not really connected with sort of global issues in a way that I suppose that if you'd used London, yes, that's true, of course, for massive parts of London, but London is the centre of government, so this localized idea and the way in which like I guess power becomes federalized in this sort of situation, and the sort of failures of that felt really fitting. And I was comparing this with so I know that like the BBC had previously, there was a film called The War Game, which also looks at nuclear war, and that was supposed to be shown in 1965, but it was believed that it might provoke panic, depression, and mass suicides. So the BBC didn't screen it, and then like 20 years later, it makes and screens Threads. So we've seen this sort of like transition, I guess, in terms of the importance of showing this. But it also struck me that, and again, I'll put some photos of this on our Instagram, but there's this amazing book that I was just waving at Marsha, called When the Wind Blows by Raymond Briggs. So that's, for those who know, The Snowman, which is probably the most famous of Raymond Briggs' books. This is in the sort of same style. It's in comic strip style, with his kind of very recognizable cartoon illustrations. But it is the story of a couple who basically go through the same situation as Threads, but they are very rural. So they don't get directly hit by the blast, they get impacted basically by fallout. And it's, again, it feels that same sort of like helplessness, poignancy, kind of normalization of this couple's situation, and then the way in which like a lot of their sort of narrative is like, oh, the newspaper's not here yet. Oh well, I suppose it would be delayed by the bomb, and the milkman will come, and you know, the local shop will be open. He doesn't close for anything, even, you know, the bomb. And, you know, spoiler, they die. So it felt like there was obviously like this focus on, as it were, sort of the ordinary people, and I guess, you know, Sheffield fitted quite well with that idea, I think.
Sure.
Also with the like style of the film as well, because it's, you know, it's filmed a lot like a documentary, right? So how did you feel that kind of worked, the sort of style of the whole thing?
Well, so the film kind of uses a lot of kind of title cards, dropping in like statistics, and specifically like listing off the effects of like different stages of the nuclear event. And sometimes there was also a narrator who I think they used quite sparsely throughout the movie. When he popped in, I'd forgotten he was there originally, and I was like, oh, who's this talking over this? I mean, I think the documentary style also kind of seems to more ground it in reality. It's not this like, I think it kind of avoids this like, oh, this is this alternative fictional world. It's almost the sense that you're watching this documentary makes it feel like it's already happened, and it's like a possibility for your kind of life. That, you know, it feels tangible, I'd say. What I also found was quite striking, and what I read a lot about the time that the movie was released, was just that fear of nuclear war, which it's definitely in my generation. I don't know if you had it much when you were growing up there, but I think, you know, I've had these sort of like World War III jokes, you know, happen, you know, on the playground when I was in school and stuff, but you know, it was really something that felt tangible. It just kind of felt like, oh, ha, ha, ha. You know, that was funny, whatever. But yeah, no, nuclear war, especially through the years that I've grown up, doesn't feel, it's not one of these things that's like sits at the back of my mind that I worry about. Whilst at that time in the 80s, I didn't realize the extent that was something that people really thought about and cared about. I think I was reading just accounts on YouTube and like in YouTube comments on various video essays about people saying like their personal experience was like, yeah, as a 10-year-old, this boy, like this man was saying how as a 10-year-old he'd have literal nightmares about it, and that like one day he'd just come to the living room and his dad had like rented a videotape of Threads, and they'd sat down and watched it together, and it was actually really disturbing for him to see this, and especially as it being that feeling that this is actually a possibility at this time.
I think so. I was born at the end of 86, so it would have been very like much kind of current, because we're still in the Cold War at that point. But I think by the time I was old enough to be aware, we're talking about the sort of, you know, the end of the 90s, and by then it's almost like I suppose felt that we had passed it, you know, you know, the Cold War was over, and I think it's only perhaps more recently, with some of the concerns around the rise of unpredictable leaders, populist leaders, and totalitarian leaders, the impact of obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sort of potential for a war in Europe more widely. There's always been the North Korea sort of concern with regard to weapons testing. So although on the one hand it feels like there's been greater international cooperation to move towards sort of the ban on nuclear testing, for example, which hasn't been isn't unanimous, but we've got lots of countries who have signed up against that. We've got the banning of proliferation and so on, but you've still got countries that are both unsettled and possess nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And I suppose one of the things that really stays with me is the replacement, the vote on replacing Trident. So this was in 2007. So obviously, but by that point I was very politically aware, and it was like the vote was cast in favour of replacing Trident, our nuclear missiles in the UK. But there was considerable opposition, and I think that it reflected a changing kind of attitude to this idea of kind of like the preservation of a nuclear deterrent. After all, Britain is one of only 9 countries that has nuclear weapons of its own. And this question about kind of moving towards disarmament, moving towards sort of taking the lead in removing nuclear weapons from our field of play. Obviously, those who believe that if we don't have them, then Russia and China and North Korea still will. So it's the deterrent argument which was there right from the start. But so I suppose that in that sense it sort of played in and out of world narrative, and I think it's coming back a little bit now.
Sure. I mean, I guess with like what I was saying, especially with like what I was saying with like experiencing that sort of worry of nuclear war, that's very from like, I live in the UK in a like white middle class, sort of background. So it's very much like, a personalized experience when I've sort of said that, because I can also appreciate that people who might be in actual, we've spoken previously about on the podcast, my family's like Ukrainian, so we do know people who are going through sort of like a war situation, but also in the Middle East as well. Lots of stuff like that going on, and that could be a very different story to people who live there.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I think you raise another point that's interesting, that's just that yes, we can sort of talking from this sort of privileged position, but actually when it comes to things like nuclear war, there isn't really a privileged position, right?
No,
again, we'll talk later about things like fallout and the idea of kind of the rich in protected societies and the bunkers, in the same way that we do when we're talking about kind of the climate emergency and so on. But actually, one of the points, surely, of something like Threads is that there is a class element insofar as we have Jimmy in this young couple that we see at the beginning. He is kind of working class in a council flat, his family, and then we see the sort of slightly wealthier family of Ruth, who have a cellar in their house. So they last, their shelter lasts longer than the shelter built under the stairs by Jimmy's family, which basically blows apart as soon as the bomb goes off. So there is a class element, except for the fact that ultimately they all die. So Ruth survives, but it's not particularly because she doesn't stay in the cellar. Her parents do, and they get killed. It's both, yes, there is an element of kind of privilege being discussed, but there's also just like everybody's going to die. There's a Tom Lehrer song that I might have mentioned before. I'll put it on the playlist. It's one of my favorites. But again, writing very much in the sort of like era of Americans, I suppose, believing that it's not if but when the bomb drops, which was, you know, very common concern. And it's called, you know, we shall all go together when we go. What a comforting fact that is to know. And so it goes on. And, you know, it's a very funny satire, but you know, that I suppose is the ultimate point here, isn't it? But I mean, coming back to our sort of point about the sort of focus of the documentary style, it is very much on this idea that we see it through the eyes of these individuals. And I didn't feel at the beginning, it feels like you're getting to know these characters. But actually, well, like Jimmy dies straight off. And obviously, like the amount of sort of dialogue, interaction, story just fades away because there is no story anymore, really. It's just one sort of bad thing after another rather than any personal narrative. There's nothing, no lived experience other than the horror, ongoing horror. So yeah, I was interested. There was a good article which I will quote from, if I can just find it in my notes. Let me put it. Oh, it goes. So this was again, we'll put the the links in the show notes. But this was from a website called avclub.com, and the quotation reads, "Thread's characters feel like genuine people who just staggered straight out of the neighborhood pubs. You can tell because you don't really like them all that much." And then it's like, "Leading this pack of people you don't particularly mind seeing annihilated is Reece Dinsdale as Jimmy, just your ordinary aimless punter with nothing on his mind beyond sports and sex." And I have to say, I'm guilty of feeling pretty much, you know, like this. These people are, you know, the pregnancy feels sort of foolish. Jimmy is just so sleazy really when we first see him trying to like make the moves on Ruth and so on. And like Jimmy's mate, he's like, "Oh, you're gonna get married, better make the most of the time you've got, you know, we're gonna pull those birds over there."
Like, they're not particularly likable people. But even so, I guess what the article's kind of saying, I'm just recontextualized the fact that they are just like kind of normal people going about their life, and this is the effect that sort of, you know, the fallout of nuclear war and stuff is, you know, that's all how it's affecting them.
So it really adds to that sort of realism, doesn't it? The sort
Jimmy
of ordinariness.
Well, I think his character just dies, doesn't he? Because he's just out running about during the blast.
I mean, you know, the sort of futile sort of thing, I must find Ruth. There's a sort of commentary on this sort of narrative that runs in parallel between the sort of dropping of the bomb and the marriage and future relationship and baby coming that that nobody, you know, seems really to want. But this idea that at the same time as like on a global scale, you've got the imminence of war and what that would mean, and on a sort of very personal scale, you've got this idea that, you know, the future is not great for people like this in this kind of situation. So the parallels there, I think, are very effectively created. So it's noticeable, I suppose, that we get this first, like, apparently it's 46 minutes of film before the sirens come, and we see these, like, both the sort of complete unawareness, like in the first scene where Jimmy is flicking past the like global news about imminent nuclear war in favor of the football scores, which I guess is, you know, we've talked about before, like, I suppose, like, you meeting other students, like me chatting to like normal people who come into my life or whatever, who are not like, they don't necessarily have the sort of overarching interest with what's happening in the world and the country. It's more about their own personal sort of situation and things like that. Did you find there was something familiar therefore about like realistic about the lack of interest, awareness in what might happen?
What, especially with sort of like Jimmy
particularly
as a character?
probably,
I mean, I think one of the opening scenes is kind of exactly that, is like they're sat, it's Jimmy and Ruth sat in a car sort of overlooking, you know, Sheffield and the hills and stuff, and she's, I think there's a, they're on, and on the radio is kind of being talked about what's going on in terms of politics with the Cold War and stuff, and Jimmy switches it off to go listen to the football scores or something like that, and like you can see, like, I think, you know, maybe I feel my frustration sort of mirrored in Ruth's reaction to him being like, what are you doing, like, turn that back on, you know. Yeah, I mean, it is tough, and I'm again, I think, I feel like we talk a lot on the podcast about, like, specifically our experiences of people in the real world outside of these sort of dystopian fictional you know, events and stuff, and also the generational differences. I don't know, maybe I think there's a bit of disparity between the people that I surround myself with and who I consider very kind of aware and progressive and, you know, trying to make a difference, and then sort of, especially I've come to university and found that not everyone's like that, and that's kind of like it's almost quite hard to swallow, because it's kind of, you know, I feel like it's so easy to be informed and lots of information out there, and people just kind
and you
of
would expect people who are getting a university
to
education
get a degree
to engage
to
with these big
engage in this
ideas.
stuff.
That's kind of the
Exactly,
point.
yeah, especially like in an academic setting.
And I think this is something that's getting us some interesting discussion at the moment, because you know, I know you're involved with Palestinian protests on campus and that kind of activism, and obviously there's been a lot of discussion about the way that has emerged across American campuses.
I mean, worldwide there's this sort of like almost like student kind of political movement happening, which I think I don't really know the last time something like that has really like come up and taken place, like almost to that global level, because for people who don't know, there's a number of encampments across universities, like across the world, to try and get universities, especially Sheffield, who this is where the sort of like industrial side of the city ties in, is responsible. Like the University of Sheffield puts funding into engineers who develop the weapons that they literally use in Gaza at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, you're mirroring something that, you know, is been one of the central messages here about this idea of universities disentangling themselves from the weapons trade.
The conflicts. Exactly.
But at the same time, I think there's been an interesting discussion about, you know, and I as I'm sure you do, and any situations where these camps have been used to kind of promote anti-Semitism or create fear on campuses. But there's been an interesting kind of dialogue there about, you know, well, also these are universities. It's the place in which you should be able to have these uncomfortable conversations, you know, in an informed, intellectual manner. And you know, generally student protests have been on the right side of history. We can look at the Vietnam War as a really strong parallel in the States.
Very true.
So you know, and I think that this is, again, this idea about, you know, being aware. You know, CND still exists, still has influence, but it's not got necessarily the feeling of that kind of grassroots political movement that it used to have. But then it's possibly because our concerns about the biggest threats to the world have changed, and now we're looking at the influence of climate protesters and so on, for example, in the same kind of sense. So Jimmy, definitely embodies that kind of like concern with, you know, just himself. Although there's a sort of another thing, which is that the helplessness of ordinary people in this kind of situation. And I felt there was quite a good reflection on the way in which like the public is gaslighted by gaslit perhaps by the government. You know, when the siren goes, you know, you should be inside. If you're not inside, you should lie on the ground. And oh, here we go. This is the section. I might try and find it actually from the film. But do not stay out of doors. If you are caught in the open, lie down. You are better off in your own home. Stay there. If anyone dies, move the body to another room in the house. And this mirrors these again, which I was aware of, but I've now sort of learned quite a lot more about this publications and videos that were made by the government about how to handle nuclear attacks. So those were called the Protect and Survive films. And again, the language is really mirrored in the Raymond Briggs book, because basically the guy is like he's like, the government leaflet says this, but the council leaflet says this. So which one is it supposed to be? And a whole kind of joke about you're supposed to put your doors, which you've taken off, you're supposed to put them at 60 degrees. And he's like, what's 60 degrees? He's like, I have to go to the shop and buy a protractor. And I was like, they've sold out of protractors. And I was like, it's completely this sort of like, how like ridiculing this whole thing. But in 1980, Panorama had leaked copies of the Protect and Survive films that they knew had been made, and they broadcast them because they were trying to show out like how ludicrous these were. And I feel that some of that ludicrous sense and the sort of constant reiteration before the sirens go of like, I'm very hopeful about a peaceful outcome and so on being broadcast. So you sort of get why people would become complacent and disenfranchised from the government message.
No, exactly. One thing that was quite shocking in the movie was there was a sort of section where before the bomb hits, where there's sort of this almost attempt at mass migration out of the city. People are trying to leave, but the government have like blocked these roads and saying, no, turn back, like don't leave, like the safest place you are is at home, like we blocked the roads, you can't get out, this is for sort of official personnel only. And because I don't know how accurate a lot of the government action depicted in threads is to what could actually happen.
Well, I suppose what it reflects is this idea of the underpreparedness in terms of having sufficient food and supplies in cities, and therefore needing to maintain transport infrastructure so that these things can still happen and not block up the roads. I can see that as a likely scenario, but of course the idea of being told you're safest in your home
in the center of a city that's a high target for a nuclear bomb is crazy to me. And even sort of following that section when they have, I think this is like maybe a month after the nuclear blast has happened, and there's another actual mass migration out of the city, people by foot walking to Buxton, which is in the Peak District, for people who don't know, I think about 17 miles out of Sheffield and stuff. There's this other like sort of mass migration by foot, and they have like another plane fly over and announce to the people like making their way that like to turn back and go back to their homes. And it's just like, again, I can see that being like, okay, infectious diseases, fallout, whatever. There's a number of reasons why that could be happening, but just I think seeing this almost kind of disparity between the government bodies and what they're trying to get citizens to do. And it's at some, at one point in the film, it seems like, okay, they're trying to be like protected. At other parts of the film, it's just like, these people are like suffering and telling them to go back, and especially seeing, there's a section in the movie where they talk about how the sort of power flows down in different sections of government when these sorts of events can happen, and how it can go from central government to local government, and seeing these like local government officials responsible for a nuclear war making decisions about how food is distributed, because obviously they have to make, there's like low stockpiling of food. Obviously it can't be grown because of the nuclear winter, you can't really grow food without sunlight. They're making these like very almost utilitarian decisions about like, well, we got to wait, some people are going to be dying anyway, what's the point of giving them food and then having less food for people following that? It's just,
and that is a really tough thing. I mean, I think I felt that on the one hand there was a kind of a sympathy in a way for the complete sense that you could never be prepared for this kind of thing to happen. There is, is nowhere they could be. And then also the sort of
it's so
like
devastating.
pathetic way in which, I mean, yeah, there's this whole idea that even in a city like Sheffield, there's sorts of decisions that local government are usually making are on a smaller scale than this kind of thing, and that they're obviously they wait for instruction from on high. But as soon as the attack happens, we get this loss of communication.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting blog by a guy called David Alan Green, who writes particularly about the power of the kind of imagery of the telephone. So the attempts to being able to maintain any contact with any other kind of external bodies, especially ones that can kind of tell them what to do, when the government officials for this emergency power have been relocated to this basement, and they become blocked in after the explosion, and eventually, with no oxygen reaching the bunker, they all die, and nobody really notices. When the military finally arrive, this question about, is there any point in sending in the military to a place where they're just going to get radiation sickness and die, and so on? All they find is this dusty phone and these dead bodies, and it's very kind of poignant reflection on kind of like the breakdown of any sort of government. But at the same time, like even when the local government group were alive, we had all that kind of like them just shouting at each other, like the panic. And how could you be prepared for that, as you say, when it comes to the sort of harsh utilitarianism of it all?
A lot of the people, sort of enlisted I think they're saying, a lot of the people enlisted don't have the sort of training. There is, well, first of all,
what training is there?
Should there be? But like they literally, I think it's very clearly stated in the movie, they don't know what they're doing. They're just kind of,
it's like the COVID outbreak, like sort of times 1,000. This idea that this is a situation where nobody really knows what to do. But in this particular scenario, and I just felt like everybody's waiting, as we always would do, for somebody to fix it. Like the police will come, the army will come, and that's where the hospital scenes I thought were really powerful.
Yes, the hospital scenes were, Jesus, that's tough.
So what? Tell me about what you kind of thought about those. You can deal with the gory horribleness of that.
So the movie kind of follows Ruth a lot through her experience, and it focuses on different characters, but she kind of eventually reaches this hospital, and it's overrun with people who are experiencing this radiation poisoning, people who are literally suffering physical wounds from the blast. And I think there's, the narrator comes on in the movie and talks about how the doctors literally can't do anything without like running water, electricity, all the tools they had to help. And I think what really hits quite a lot is just, there are these people just sat around sitting in silence, coughing, spluttering, and then you hear these screams of pain as and it cuts to sort of shots of like bits of glass being taken out of people's wounds, they're being treated, and like obviously there's no sort of anesthetic that can sort of cease people's pain. It's just pure like, you're just gonna have to
bite down on this rag.
Bite down
your
on
leg
this rag.
now.
Yes. Oh my god, the bit was soaring off the leg, and it was constant. It was kind of graphic, but there was a lot of cutting just to the floor with like where there was drips of like blood and liquid just everywhere.
And I found really powerful the big box of Paxo, or whichever brand it was, table salt being poured into water. The only way they can try and make saline is by that's about all they've got for disinfectant and so on. It's that was tough. I think the worst thing for me about the hospital thing was again this feeling like of all the people crowding and like blocking the nurse or doctor like against a wall, and just that feeling that like it felt like they might well trample them to death, like looking to an authority figure who no longer has the power to to help. I found that really, really hard. And the same thing with this idea about like, how do you maintain law and order? They haven't got the prison capacity. Nobody's planned that. They can't even maintain the prisons they've got. And I think there's a quotation is just like, well, just shoot them. And that's what
like
we start seeing. Plus, of course, the idea that the people who police the situation are just as hungry as those who are looting. So they kill the looters or arrest them or whatever and take their food. So they're just looters in uniform essentially.
Looters in uniform.
So the food shortage and the looters is really hard. And we talk a lot about sort of the impacts of any kind of disaster scenario on the disabled, and of course there are many more disabled by the time this bomb has gone off. But this idea that basically if you can work, then you're fed because that is currency. But if you can't, you starve.
And I think there's a section especially where it kind of rolls around to winter, and they're saying how a lot of the young and old die just because they're more susceptible to they're unable to work, therefore starving, and also more susceptible to the sort of elements. One thing that's really as well was quite shocking, I think, was when sort of 10 years after the blast, Ruth has given birth to her child, and this is like maybe 10-13 years afterwards, and Ruth passes away with her child. What's her daughter's name?
Jane,
and Jane's sort of watching her, and Ruth must be about 30, definitely no older than 40, but she looks like she's in her 80s. Like she's very wrinkled, white hair, like really at the end of her, looks like she's at the end of her life. Well, she is, but in a kind of age sense, but really that's just also another effect of the radiation. Is like how much it ages you, and just I think it was quite a shocking one.
And I think that that whole kind of like the way it takes us through those years with things like it was the idea that this would be the ending of access to fuel, for example. So we're talking about obviously an oil-based fuel society, as we are to a lesser but still prolific extent now. So this would be the last time there would be like mechanical harvesting, and then you see them like in these incredibly primitive, back-breaking farming with tools. It reminded me of when we were talking about the society and they find land for agriculture, but they're like, the only way that we can farm is with picks and hoes and so on. It's so that very primitive idea that takes us into post-societal sort of world. And Ruth, I mean the giving birth to the baby is horrific. She's also prior to that we don't see it graphically, but she is evidently selling her body for dead rats to eat.
Yes, I remember reading this in notes. I remember that scene, but I didn't realise that's what
I figured that was what they were getting at.
Selling herself. What was?
I mean, I think that they were alluding to sort of prostitution of some sort. Right. But you're right. It was oblique, but that was how I'd understood it, and I think that's how other people have understood it as well. But those dead rats, and the dead sheep when they eat the raw dead sheep. Okay. According to Karen Meager, who played Ruth, that was a real raw dead sheep.
Why?
And she was a vegetarian, and she was like, it was so gross. It was like all gelatinous in my mouth.
That's crazy. Why would you?
Well, they didn't have much budget, did they? Probably cheaper to get a dead sheep than it is to make one out of clay or whatever.
That's crazy.
We haven't talked, to go back to kind of Jane, about the way in which they manipulate language for this kind of post-society, kind of Neanderthal sort of society, because I found that really
that was fascinating. That's really interesting. I didn't think about the fact that the language would change, especially I mean I don't know how like what the research behind that was, because obviously that I'm sure there's still quite a huge adult population who was sort of pre-society, pre-bomb, you know, would have talked sort of the way we talk now. But there's this kind of almost like deconstructed English.
Yeah,
And
so
I don't know whether that was partly due to, because Jane, Ruth's daughter, obviously was gestating during the time that like nuclear blast occurred, and it was kind of said that the effect of that on fetuses is sort of defects with the limbs, but especially cognitive ability, and yeah, a lot of like mental disabilities will be resultant of that. So yeah, I think Jane is discussed to have like severe
yeah, that was
cognitive
my understanding, that
impairments.
she had learning difficulties as a consequence of
And
her,
I think like a lot of people on the internet were saying how she especially struggled to understand her like the actual dying of her mother. Like I don't think there was that. I don't know whether, you know, that's
I don't know whether
true,
I
but
thought that. I mean, I thought it was more likely just that death would be so. I mean, it's like going back into you know, when we look at sort of history, going back to antiquity and right through really to kind of modernity, which is that
yes.
we're not exposed to death, but the moment you move into a sort of post pre-medical society, then you would be exposed to death all the time. So I felt that it was more the matter of factness. There was a terrible pathos to the way in which, you know, she basically says, Ruth, work, Ruth, like work is the only thing that, you know, they get up for, so that they eat and so on. And I thought that the loss of language, yes, there was the idea of obviously kind of cognitive dysfunction and learning disability, but there was also this idea that in this world, people do not have the scope psychologically to talk. You know, what would you talk about other than functional things? And I thought you saw that with the whole, like watching the video that they had, like an old video of different animal skeletons and so on. It's just reductive to this, you know, this is the only kind of education or conversation.
They can receive,
and there was also a scene where it's like a parody of the, parody's not quite the word, but like a lens upon the nativity scene where it's Christmas and they're all sitting around in this hovel around a fire. Nobody is speaking. Like there is no storytelling, there is no hope of any sort. And that, I thought, you know, then reflected into Jane. That might bring us nicely to the kind of final scenes of the film, where we see Jane fighting over a rabbit with a boy who's trying to steal it from her, and subsequently her rape by this boy. I thought that, you know, the final scenes were utterly heartbreaking. I mean, how did you feel about that ending and the birth?
The birth was tough. I mean, I didn't even think about like the sort of inclusion of the rape. I guess it's just to the point that there are some people who are going to be more like vulnerable than others, which I didn't obviously is obvious, but I was like, that's something that I didn't even think about as like
it's also this question, isn't it, about whether once you remove any kind of meaningful legal process, and once you remove the idea of, I guess, ownership not being subject immediately to force, so, you know, all property, including your right over your own body, is only yours as long as you can fight for it.
Which is exactly that.
And she must be like, she was like 13, right? So
she must have been. And I don't know, it's just harrowing. And like in the final scenes, she gets to a hospital and is like trying to communicate to this nurse, basically, like she's having a baby, again having that struggle with like communication, either because of like just the evolution of language for her generation, maybe, I guess, because the boys that she also speaks to kind of talk similar.
I was interested, they use the word coney to talk about a rabbit, and somebody was writing about this idea that, you know, this is a word that is largely antiquated. It's like an Elizabethan word and things like that.
Mhm.
But I thought it was also regional, possibly as well, because
Could be.
I'm sure that I've read books set in the north of England where Coney has been maintained.
Mhm.
I think they use it in Lord of the Rings as well, but that is not really indicative of very much other than early 20th century English. But yeah, so maybe some archaizing there as well to sort of show
Yeah,
this idea of returning to more primitive
yeah.
times. Did you
But
assume that the baby was stillborn?
yes, I made that
Yeah.
assumption.
Yeah,
Because there's
so
no
did
crying, it's
I.
just silent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not all viewers seem to have concluded the same thing as far
Really?
as I could tell.
What did other people
Um,
suggest?
I suppose just that, this was a birth of a baby that is sort of so, into a world where it's so I guess that it's so subnormal or whatever it might be that, the baby doesn't make a noise or whatever. But it struck
I made
me that it must
assumption it
be
was
a
stillbirth. Yeah.
stillborn from the way that it was.
Yeah.
And therefore, depending which way you look at it, kind of like changes the way that you understand like that final scream that ends the
Yeah.
film.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because is it like at the loss of the child, or is it at the existence of the child,
Yeah.
or at the world generally? Yeah, so there is no optimism at all. There is no hope in
No,
this film, which I think is
not
rare
at all.
for the things that we often look at.
Sort of see, yeah, I kind of feel like, I don't know, hugely a lot of the films that you see is kind of like, oh, the human condition, sort of like contrast to the like terrible situations that, whatever character gets put in, but this is fully, it's bleak. It is bleak. And I think that is what makes it so just, you're not going to want to watch this again. There's just nothing hopeful to take away from it. It is just, you're kind of left with that empty feeling of like, okay, if this happens, that is the reality.
Yeah, and I mean, this sort of brings us to this conversation about, when you're trying to get a message across, how useful is fear as a tool? We know that it's not been particularly effective in terms of the climate crisis, for example.
No,
The
not
the
at all,
data is
yeah.
now fairly good that people sort of can't engage with this idea of, I guess, a fear narrative. But for me, I don't know, I felt that it worked because it basically said, in a way that's, sort of proving the huge level of sort of scientific research that Jackson, the director, had put into this thing that is too big for you to imagine, and therefore you are not imagining. This is it. This is what it looks like. And that actually is not like fear mongering so much as sort of like just presenting fact. And I wonder whether actually, I guess, more ideas that make concrete the things that we cannot imagine, the kind of end of the world, the huge scale apocalypse, whatever,
Yeah.
actually would be quite useful. I mean, on the one hand, I think that, I was looking at the kind of impact. We know that, so Neil Kinnock, who was the leader of the Labour Party at the time, he wrote to the writer and the director to sort of say, this quotation, the dangers of complacency are much greater than any risks of knowledge. So actually saying, the value of this knowledge. And then also there was a journalist called Sue Lloyd-Roberts looked at the data on civil defence volunteers following the release of Threads over the sort of subsequent years, and basically saying, like, after these Threads and films like it, like, anyone might be forgiven for taking the better to die than to survive attitude. I think it's the same as Jimmy's friend, who's like, I want to be pissed and I want to be right under the bomb when it falls.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just thought that was a potential thing for sort of like saying what, this idea that it has the potential for like waking people up, but what do they do in response to that? Do they feel more helpless, or do they feel more engaged? One of the sort of things, I guess, about like the title and Threads and so on is to show us like how like interconnected we all are, and how you can't break one thread without unraveling the whole thing. And there's that spider's web right at the beginning, and that's quite a lasting message. And somebody, who was it? Again, it was the AV Club article that was basically saying that this is There is a living tapestry of men and women and people, and the beauty of that tapestry and the quality of our lives will depend on how much each of us is prepared to take responsibility for ourselves, and each of us is prepared to turn around and help by our own efforts those who are unfortunate. Thread seems to argue that this tapestry was all an illusion, its individual threads easily torn asunder by a sudden hot wind, or even slowly picked apart like the blankets being disassembled by Jane and her fellow Neanderthals by the gradual erosion of our empathy for each other, which of course fits very much what we were saying. So the beginning of what I just said, there was a part of the Margaret Thatcher quote that on her "there is no such thing as society" speech, and sort of like basically, yeah, Threads picking apart that kind of whole idea. So there is society, but you know, it's so fragile. And that depiction of the complete like kind of loss of empathy of anyone supporting anyone else and so on, everybody being threatened by everybody else. I wrote a whole essay on empathy and dystopian fiction in our newsletter of whatever last Sunday was. And yeah, so that's an area that I think is really worth us considering. Here we are, 40 years after this film was made. The Doomsday Clock, which was first created as an image to show the closeness of the world to its destruction, starting with this idea of the risk of nuclear weapons, now stands at 90 seconds to midnight. So if anyone's not aware of this, it is closer to midnight than it has ever been. This is from 2024 on account of continuing war in Ukraine and Russia's suspension of its participation in arms agreements, the war in Gaza, and the fact that 2023 was the hottest year on record. So these are sort of existential threats at present. And so, yeah, you know, the situation with respect to the existence of nuclear weapons continues to be a part of the risks to the world if there were to be a third world war, which is being much talked about at the moment. I mean, what do you think? Do you recommend people to watch this now? What do you think the value of it is?
I think it recontextualizes, especially with the like release of Oppenheimer in the past year, because Claire has rewatched that, done a research on this episode. But yeah, I feel like that film, even though I really liked Oppenheimer, and I think it was an interesting perspective on the atomic bomb, sort of seeing it from the creator's view, I still think kind of sensationalizes it in a sense. This is a very like opposite end of the spectrum of like, you know, there's the people who created it, and this is the people who like in threads who get affected on the other end of the
because
sort of
Oppenheimer
stick,
maintains its distance by seeing things through the eyes of Oppenheimer and his associates. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And this is exactly the opposite.
It barely, like, I don't think Oppenheimer really, I think it's just, you know, it kind of talks about this bomb in this abstract sense. This is really what that creation means for people. And it was just, yeah, I think everyone needs to see it once, I'd say. Quite genuinely. I don't think I've seen another film like it yet.
No. And I think that maybe to finish on, there's another bit from the end of this chapter in Linsky's book, Everything Must Go, which basically sort of said, so when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, described it as a time of nuclear danger not seen since the height of the Cold War. And so that humanity was just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. But what interested me more than that point was this observation that actually the people who spoke most alarmingly about nuclear Armageddon were actually the people who were the aggressors. So people like Putin and his apologists took this idea of like existential terror and basically said, okay, so you've got two options. You've got the one where Russia takes Ukraine, and you've got the one where the end of the world happens. So manipulating that idea of kind of terror into something that can now be weaponized as a sort of you must give in to us. And this perhaps again fits in with this idea that, you know, it's not just the launching of nuclear weapons, it's the having of nuclear weapons. Now, I think it was Thatcher again who said, you know, they can't be disinvented, but again, referring to Oppenheimer, the way in which he moved towards, ideas around arms treaties and sort of unilateral agreements over the possession of such weapons and their developments and so on, seems to me that there's still much more work to be done on that, but it requires world government, which obviously we have the UN, but it doesn't cover everybody's interests, I suppose we might say. So yeah, I think it's timely. It's timely for itself, and it's also timely for this idea about looking at, I guess, the consequences of anything potentially world-ending, including the climate crisis, through the lens of this is what the suffering is actually like for those who endure it. I don't think we need too many films like Threads, though. I think that people would switch off pretty fast.
Yeah, exactly.
But it definitely achieves something quite extraordinary, really.
Yes.
I just want to say one last thing from my perspective of one of the things that really upset me and that I have since come to terms with, which was the incinerated cat. I was exceedingly upset by what happened to the cat. And then I read that the way that they filmed this was that they gave the cat a load of catnip, and it did that thing that cats do where they ride around on the ground and look absolutely ridiculous, and then they played it backwards.
Yes.
And that's how they got the cat to die in the fire. And I feel a bit better because actually the cat was very happy at the point of filming.
That is good. That is good.
Yeah,
that was an upsetting one.
I'm always worse about like dead cats than I am about charred babies.
Yeah. But yeah.
Wow. Anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered there?
I don't think so. I think there's a lot we've said.
There's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. So we're going to have a nice rest now, having revisited all of that. But
yes.
It's a very interesting discussion. So thank you, Marsha.
No worries.
So we are trying to keep everybody informed at the moment about what's coming up in the near future on the pod, but be aware that there will be some changing to scheduling because Marsha's going on holiday, so
I am
we'll have to endure gaps in the program while she travels around Europe.
I know. Marsha on tour, dystopian fiction on tour.
That's right. Yeah. So we're going to cheer ourselves up by doing the Truman Show. That will be episode 18, and then episode 19 we're going to do Fallout because
make a comeback on the nuclear.
Exactly. Some good attention on that. But that one will come out in mid-July, so a break from that. So I'll publish those on Instagram and also on our Podbean website. You can follow us at Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs. You also check out our Substack as well as our Instagram for more dystopian excitement. Thank you very much, Marsha.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, listeners.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
See you soon.